thanks everyone for having me. Thanks to Klaus for inviting me. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk about my current favorite subject, which is microservices, and I definitely appreciated the opportunity to talk about it before lunch and hope I didn't blow this whole presentation for everyone who was there. I know that we've got a couple of presentations on microservices this afternoon. I have no doubt they're completely complementary. There's going to be no overlap in content whatsoever, but I'll just give you a bit of background on myself and on the company I work for, CA, as well as the API Academy, which is the group I run within CA. Then I'll give you some history on microservices, but the meat of this is really where did they come from and how does that link to why they're useful and why they matter. So we'll talk about that as well as trying to give you some practical tips on how to get started with microservices, which I think is from the sounds of it is something that people in the room are already getting started, already well down the path in some cases, and already questioning how's this different from everything else that's coming forth. And then I give a case study of what I'll just say now is, in my opinion, like the best case study for microservices that we can pick, which is probably not the company you think of when you hear that, and then get into some of the trouble spots, prerequisites, things like that. So hopefully it's useful. But first of all, just a bit about myself. I'm actually a coast-to-coast guy. I grew up in the Toronto area. I went to Acadia University way out on the Atlantic coast of Canada, and now I'm here in Vancouver. Actually, I live in a small community in the interior of BC known as Cloverdale. And you believe me, with the traffic these days, it feels like I'm coming from the Okanagan or something when I come to the city. But I'm sure you're all going to be in Cloverdale this weekend, right? It's the rodeo. It's like the second biggest rodeo in Canada. It's a big deal. Anyway, I moved to the Lower Mainland about 9 years ago now. When I worked at CIBC for about 11 years. Then I changed to work for IBM in a global position. I got to pick my destination, and so my wife and older son at the time, and of course younger son now, we live here. In my copious amounts of free time, I play hockey and record music, which is stuff I'm going to do. So in 2012, I joined a small startup company called Layer 7 Technologies. Anyone heard of Layer 7 locally? So that's great. We were a good, successful Vancouver startup story. We're acquired by CA Technologies, one of the biggest software companies in the world, in 2013. And so we were just talking about office space before. I think people are always moving around, Yaletown, Gastown, and so on. We were on Melville and Thurlow for a while. We now are in the HSBC building over by the Art Gallery. It's a great location, especially in the summer. A lot of people in the office have a lot of fun. There we are curling, and obviously these are a little older pictures. We'll get all like the surfing pictures up next, but skiing and so on, drinking, all the good Canadian sports. But it's a great place to work, great environment, lots of fun activities going along with Agile and Laura's here today, and she's a big part of that. So we have a great time. But also in 2012, when I first joined Layer 7, we started something called the API Academy. So Layer 7 and CA, the stuff that we work on in Vancouver is all about APIs and API management and helping companies get into the digital economy. Actually, we have an API Gateway product. I know there was a whole presentation on Amazon's API Gateway. Our product is so good, Amazon's copying us, right? So we have one of the leading technologies there. We found that when we were working with companies on this new API stuff, that a lot of times, as opposed to the past, we grew up as a more SOA and web services security company, as opposed to that past where it was pretty well defined and people would say, yes, we know there's an ESB and there's a registry and there's a gateway and all these things. In the world of APIs, people would be like, how can my business be disrupted with APIs? Or how do I spell API? So we felt that rather than go in and try and just push a piece of technology down their throats right away, we would say, you know what? What are you trying to do? What do you need on your strategy for APIs? What about architectural practices that would be useful? Design? What are the elements that people in the web have used on APIs? How can you apply it to your business? And then, by the way, we have a good solid API platform that you can use as well. So it's been a complementary strategy. We're a small team. We actually added a new member today. But we're growing gradually. But we've been working with a lot of companies, and so one of our members, Mike Amundsen, has written a lot of books for O'Reilly on APIs and web APIs, and we work with InfoQ on publishing some magazines around APIs. We do public speaking. We've done global events. We run an API 360 Summit series, and as part of our CA World event for the company, we ran a Microservices bootcamp last year. So, working in the API space in the last year and a half, or almost 2 years now, it's been impossible to avoid microservices. It's just become this massive trend, right? And this is the quote from Phil Calcadow from, he was at SoundCloud at the time, right? Microservices are a thing these days. It was just this little bit of noise that started out when Martin Fowler and James Lewis posted this blog post naming it and saying, hey, we've heard all these common patterns going around with all these companies. They're all doing these discrete services, and so we think we're going to call this microservices. And so it's just been growing ever since. And now literally every company I talk to is doing something about microservices. They're either trying to implement microservices, trying to understand microservices, or feeling really threatened by the presence of microservices. And so, and immediately here's some information from the Fowler-Lewis blog post that launched it all, right? Pretty simple pictures, nice colors. But it's just saying, we used to build systems like this that were kind of monolithic in nature, which had these different nodes that had the same sort of services built into them. But now companies are realizing that when they get to a certain scale of their monolith, it becomes really problematic. It slows things down. There's too many dependencies, too hard to understand. We had some really good discussion before lunch about what are the reasons companies that are in this room are moving towards microservices, and those are some of the things we found, right? You bring on a new team member, and it takes them months to figure out what the whole system does, right? So rather than build things like this, what if we broke things down a little more discreetly like this and had these independent components that could talk to each other, fulfill the same scope as the overall monolith, but do it in a more nimble way that would allow for better scalability and more simplicity in understanding each component. So, some of the thought leaders around microservices would be Werner Vogels, for the AWS CTO. I found this fascinating. This particular ACMQ article, it's an interview with Vogels where he's describing the architecture of Amazon, talking about loose coupling and how they have these discrete services. It's actually from 2006, but it perfectly describes what the essence of microservices are all about. And he was always calling it service orientation, service-oriented systems. Similarly, Adrian Cockcroft from Battery Ventures, who used to work at Netflix, his definition of microservices is it's SOA with an emphasis on small ephemeral components. I've also seen him call it it's SOA, fine-grained SOA with bounded context. So the question is, this even came up at the table discussion. It comes up everywhere. Is this just SOA all over again? And I think this is an interesting question because at some level there is an overlap. Service-oriented architecture was, in its infancy, all about the way systems would integrate with each other in a more loosely coupled fashion with services that could be reused and well-defined interfaces and contracts and so on. That all matches well with microservices. What happened with SOA, though, is a couple major differences. Difference number one is those software vendors, those evil software vendors, as I stand on stage, kind of hijacked the whole concept and said, well, if you're going to do SOA, you need an ESB, and you need a registry, and you need all these different components. And they've kind of forced this architecture in the world of right down to the component level. But the other thing is that there was a broader context at play in the world of SOA. So if you remember, after the web boom first hit the enterprise, we had a big focus on centralization. There was the promise of the web meant, now companies can deliver everything possible through the web. And we've got all these multi-channel possibilities now. So we have to deliver everything that we've got centrally via the web. And so that both made technology really important for every company, but it also made technology, the implications really scary for every company, because now you had outages and it was chaos in those early days, right? So to combat the whole cowboy mentality of the early web, there was this big move to say, you know what, let's have a CIO in our organization who's going to be the most powerful technology person, take all the technology people from around the organization, report them up to the CIO, have consistency, have standards, like the golden age of enterprise architecture. That was the context in which SOA grew up. But since that point, probably iPhone moment, but also the underlying movement of Agile in gaining popularity in the enterprise has really blown that apart. Now we're saying that centralization model created a lot of bottlenecks. Command and control style organizations don't work on a large scale when you're doing software engineering. You have to be able to be agile and compete. So microservices have grown up in a very, very different world. But we can't get around the fact that the concept of service orientation is fundamental to microservices, but the way that it's being implemented and the cultural nuances of how it's being implemented are very different. So, I mean, if we look at the actual principles of SOA, right, it's really, let's decompose things into discrete services. That'll enable continuous delivery. Let's reduce the dependencies in order to facilitate change frequency, like faster changes. Let's get rid of the bottlenecks. Let's speed up development. Right? Let's have small, empowered, business-aligned teams. That's right in the microservice principles. Right? Let's break the system down into understandable parts. Things that can be understood easily when somebody comes on board, things that can be managed a lot more easily. And let's reduce the amount of unchanged code that's getting deployed. This was actually a point that brought up when I was talking to somebody who worked at Disney. He loved this. It's like, we used to, every time we do a deployment in the past, we'd have to deploy 95% of the stuff we were putting out there hadn't changed. Now with microservices, we can do that. Well, guess what? These are all Agile principles, right? If you go back to the Agile Manifesto, every one of these things maps bang on into here. So the fact is, although there are some overlaps with SOA, with microservices, it's really maps well back to what I call the Agile progression. So we had, this kind of combined Agile movement coming out of all extreme programming and other different schools of thought. That's really, was about, what? We need to be a lot faster in how we actually develop software. And then we had continuous delivery coming out of the continuous integration mindset, probably a combination of Agile meets this new SaaS deployment model. Now when companies were building software, were able to deploy their whole service in the web, and they were able to start doing things continuously. Now we have continuous delivery. This is great. Now we're moving more bottlenecks. Not only are we speeding up development, now we're speeding up deployment. Then we get into the cultural side of things and say, you know what? We're pretty fast on our processes now, but what about our organization? How can we tune our organization so we remove these kind of perverse incentives where, the ops team maybe is so focused on protecting the system that they're actually slowing things down as well. Let's change that mentality. And then we get into DevOps. Microservices I really see as the next step in this progression. It's really the idea of speeding things up architecturally. What is the architecture that matches all of these steps that come before it? And so, essentially, microservice architecture is Agile software architecture. So software architecture now is, we came out of this golden age of enterprise architecture. Now we're seeing a revival of the software architecture movement that was getting pretty popular in the early 90s. And now I see this revival, like I just attended this O'Reilly Software Architecture Conference in New York. It's a really good event. But it's pretty much a microservices conference. So people are looking again at the school of software architecture saying, okay, how do we do this? This is really the Agile realization of software architecture. And this is not my statement. When I was I had this thing of saying, what if we just called it Agile software architecture? Then that would get away from all these arguments around how big a microservice is, blah, 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 blah. And then I realized, wait a minute. Simon Brown was already there. So I don't know if you know Simon Brown. He does a Coding the Architecture blog. Really smart guy. He's written a really interesting book on software architecture. But he actually wrote up a blog post in September 2013, 5 months before the Fowler-Lewis post, saying, I always get a lot of questions about what an Agile software architecture would look like. And then he started describing it. And he said, he'd probably have small, loosely coupled components. You'd have them built, modified, and tested in isolation. They'd be flexible and adaptable deployment. He goes on to contrast it with what he called monolithic type systems. So, I mean, he was right on it. And I think that the more you look at, study at what's really successful with microservices, you'll find that I think that's essential, that what we're dealing with is the agile realization of software architecture. So we're so fascinated by this microservices movement that my colleagues and I in the API Academy wrote this book we mentioned off the top. It's actually coming out next month, a couple of weeks away. We're just going through the final editing process now. But as part of that, we challenged ourselves to come up with a one-sentence definition of microservices. And we failed. Right? So we came up with two sentences because we felt that there's really two things at play here. There's what is a microservice, and then there's a much bigger thing than that. Because I've seen a lot of work around defining what makes a microservice a microservice, and you can have lots of arguments and debates around that. But maybe the bigger thing is what makes a microservice architecture, because it's the actual architecture that where the value comes from. Because you could have the world's greatest microservice, but if it didn't fit with your overall system and goals, it wouldn't really work. So, this is just, I'm not going to read the definitions out of here, but I think we work way, way too long to nuance the language here, but I think it's pretty much generic enough that it doesn't force anybody into implementation details that aren't always necessary, but also captures the essence of microservices, what makes it different. Because we had a couple of versions of a definition of microservices that could have applied to any architecture, right? The key is things like independent deployability. That's a fundamental piece of microservices. Message-based communication, right? Network boundaries are fundamental. And then highly automated systems, evolvability, they're all really important. Okay, so I guess to take a little step back, as I said before, it's not like somebody came up with what microservices were and then said to the world, hey, I just invented microservices, go forth and implement, right? It was a case of a bunch of guys, a bunch of people from ThoughtWorks sitting at a conference in Venice, I think, and they were all trading stories about what was new, what have you been working on? Oh, I've been working with this company called Guilt, and they've been actually breaking apart this big monolithic system they had, and they're putting smaller services, they find it's really fast, and then someone else saying, oh yeah, we're doing the same thing over here at SoundCloud, and someone else, oh yeah, we're doing that too. They found this pattern emerging, and then they said, well, we better name this thing. They came up with the microservices. So really, the goals and benefits of what microservices can bring are way more important than the pedantic definitions that we can come up with. So here's some of the stories, right? You see Werner Vogels again from that same Q article talking about scale, talking about increasing system availability, and then having things go quickly. I think this is a bit of the holy grail that's in there, is that for years we've always looked at software engineering and said, well, if you want to maximize system availability, you're going to have to limit change frequency, and you're going to have to really control the production environment. If you want to be really fast, you're going to have to worry that you might destabilize the system. What Vogels is saying is, well, the way we do our architecture, we both make it safer and more available, and we also speed up the development. So that's like the ultimate holy grail of software development. The Netflix team here talking about their next generation architecture. It's all about scale, scale, scale. Right? Netflix, I was saying this at the table earlier, they're the poster child for microservices. They've got the whole open source stack. You can go down and pull down their Netflix OSS and get, here's a ready-made microservice implementation. But they're a very unique company operating at a scale that's beyond any company in the world. I think they have something like 30% of all web traffic is Netflix streaming traffic. So, they're just in their own league. So use with care. Adrian Treneman from Guilt, which is now HBC, Hudson Bay Company, bought Guilt. They were an online retail microservice pioneer. So one of the founding entities of our country is now a microservice pioneer as well. For them, it was all about removing dependencies between teams. Right? And you see this a lot. How does the overall microservice architecture help? Well, it helps when you actually break down and say, we're going to just try and streamline things so that This team doesn't have to call that team to call that team to call that team, because that's what slows down our development processes. And similarly, there's Phil Calcidow, I quoted him off the top. It was all about reducing lead time. So SoundCloud was a very nimble startup, and then they became a successful startup, and they got the weight of technical debt and customer expectations and had this big monolith, and they said, you know what, we want to go back to the way things used to be when we could just get changes out as soon as we had them built. And so they went back and broke things apart. They never got back to be as fast as they were as a startup. It's not really an achievable goal, but they got a lot faster by using microservices. And for them, it was this organic process. They pretty much followed that whole Agile progression that I mentioned before in a tighter time scale. So what does that net out to, right? Ultimately, the goal of microservices is to achieve both speed of delivery and safety of the system in terms of availability and resiliency and so on at scale. I think it's fair to say that in a monolithic world, we're actually able to achieve some level of speed and safety at a lower level of scalability. And then we're talking about scalability not just in terms of runtime volumes, but scalability in terms of development processes, in terms of number of features contained in there. But the problem is that once you reach a certain point of complexity in your monolith, you run into these issues of too many dependencies, too much complexity to try and understand in the system. And so this is really the mantra that we're putting out with the book there. But if you're interested in microservices, it's probably because you want to do this. You want to achieve speed and safety at scale. But that's way too simple. So I want to give you the eye chart now, right? And I think this starts to lead towards the actual approach to how we can make, how we can actually be tangible with microservices. So if we follow these two trajectories around, what do we get with speed? What are the benefits? What do we get with safety? And as scale and complexity move up here, I've seen, I work with a lot of companies, there's all these different common themes that arise around why you do microservices. What are the benefits that you can get? And I think that at a lower level, so if we just look at modularizing your microservice or modularizing your system environment or your application, whatever you want to call it. In other words, just the process of breaking things down, even arbitrarily, there are some benefits that you can get right off the bat. So you can get independent deployability by just breaking things down, containerizing your applications. You can get the polyglottism, it's a nice word, but really that's just the variety of technologies that you can use. Now you're not pinned to a single language, you can use multiple languages, that's good stuff. Those are some benefits that you can get, which might have an effect on speed. Also, you can manage things independently in production. You can do more fine-grained testability, so you get some gains there. But that's at a pretty low level of the architecture. That just means you're breaking things up. Once you get into cohesion, now you're going to focus on what actually goes into those containers, what actually goes into the services that I'm doing, where are the borders drawn. And this is fundamental to the success of all the companies that you've seen. Because if you don't draw the boundaries correctly, you're still going to have the dependencies. You're still going to have lack of clarity around which teams are going to be able to manage which services. So many of the big companies that are espousing the value of microservices, it's about those business-aligned teams, and it's really about fitting into that whole Agile framework. But that's where you get benefits around aligning the organization. Things become more composable now because you've got useful, self-contained, business-aligned services, right? And then on the safety side, now it makes things more replaceable because you can pull out a component if it doesn't have so many dependencies. You can be a lot more efficient around how you're doing things. And then finally, I think this is the aspect that, I would say modularization, cohesion, these are things that people are striving for today. But I think the big blind spot right now with microservices is the system behaviors. So right now, and I've talked to some of the companies that are the biggest flagship companies for microservices, they're already running into things about, well, now I've got all these services. I don't even know what services I have. How do I find the services? I'm pretty sure I just built the third user management service, but there's no way I can tell. Or they're mining their own runtime registries to try and figure out things in design time. Right? So if you can get into a system mentality, and that really means, looking at things from a more abstract layer, looking at the domains involved, understanding where the dependencies are, understanding how things are evolving, and the whole relationship between your application components, your services, the interactions, as well as even the organization around it, that's when you're going to get the full payoff and probably future-proof yourself the best. So this is what brings agility. It's what helps to bring comprehension of the whole system. So I think we see with microservices now, if you have these small services, it becomes easier for a new developer to say, okay, I understand what that component does. But you need to understand, or there has to be the knowledge within the organization of how the whole system works together. And I think this is definitely a blind spot, even for the pioneers today, where they don't have that abstraction to understand how the whole system fits. But then as well, this is where you can get much better resiliency, availability, and runtime scalability. So the point of this slide is really to say the way that you do microservices, right? This is, I hate to use, I said maturity model up there, sorry about that. I know, I hate that term. But I have to call it what it is, right? This is, you're going to go, everyone kind of starts here, everyone gets excited about Docker, and then they start to see, okay, domain-driven design, okay, I can see that, that's going to help me align things business-wise. But I think that the top layer around systematizing this thing has to be developed now. There's still a lot of evolution that has to happen. Okay. So, just quickly on this, I had my colleague Mike Amundsen and I did this O'Reilly webinar on this topic, so I can share with you the link for that. But we just did this kind of scratch pad on how do you get started. It's from an architectural perspective. Like, there's lots of ways in the code you get started, but we like to think, like I use this graph paper. Graph paper is like my ultimate whiteboard ever since I was a kid. Nerd alert, Dungeons and Dragons, drawing castles, whatever, right? Writing songs on graph paper. This is when I see a sheet of graph paper, it gets my creative juices flowing. So we started, but now I have a 2-year-old, so most of my graph paper looks like that. But anyway, so we started, how do you actually come up with a design-based approach for this? Because I think there is a real strong thread of design thinking that goes behind a lot of the successful microservices, particularly the form of the domain-driven design school from Eric Evans. So said, first and foremost, you have to understand what you're trying to achieve. And I know that everyone I talk to today, they know why they're going about doing microservices. Believe me, there are companies out there who they're just doing it because their CIO was at an offsite and came back and said, we need to be more innovative, so we have to do microservices. And then they scramble and go, microservices. But it's so important to know what you're trying to accomplish, because that's going to guide what are the right steps that you're going to take. And I think that, I talked about speed and safety at scale. That's a very high-level mantra, but you can really zero in on those individual benefits and figure out, are you more on the safety side? Are you more operationally focused? Is it all about development speed? That will help you guide which way you want to go. Next up is naturally you're going to start thinking about the services that are involved. How do I determine what services are in there? And then that's really going to help me scope in and take some sandbox efforts that can go to teams and actually build in that sandbox without having to worry about everything. And then foundationally, you'll want to start to think about what do I have to have in place in order to actually make this thing fly. This gets into the containerization discussion and all the whole management of the system, all the automation that needs to be in place. And I think this is where everybody is really zeroing in their efforts right now as we're in the early stages of this movement. But I would say that the system aspects are profound and need to be addressed as well. So I think understanding, it's not about understanding and trying to control a system. I think many of the failures that we've seen in big enterprise technology over the years have come from people's futile efforts of trying to control a system. And the number one thing in systems theory and system thinking and so on is you can never control the system. All you can do is kind of have visibility into the system, try and do your best to understand what's happening in the system, and then try and influence the system without controlling it. So I don't have time to get into all that stuff here. Next thing though is organization. So from an architectural perspective, lots of architects, we love technology, we love just getting into technology. But I think the value of the architect's role is to synthesize everything. Synthesize the architecture, the technology, synthesize all the skills associated. And really, I think, everyone heard of Conway's Law? Everyone familiar with? I'm not going to go into details on it. I think we're going to hear more about it later on. But this is about how the architecture of a system is going to mimic the structure of the organization that builds it. And I'll tell you, I've lived this one. I worked at CIBC earlier. I love CIBC. Still a loyal CIBC customer. But we had in Toronto, the whole technology organization was spread across all these big buildings in the greater Toronto area. Some of them were north of the city, some were downtown. And you could actually look at the systems and see how well they were integrated based on where the seating chart was. So I'd sit on one floor and we'd be really well integrated with the next team over in the next set of cubicles. If there's a team below us on the next floor, maybe we'd integrate okay, and if there was a project, things would go all right. As soon as we were between buildings, all bets were off. And I actually made a living there because I started a COE around integration, so we were able to help people talk to each other. But I mean, this has really been proven out. And in the microservice world, it's fundamental because so much of the value proposition now, with all those steps that we've taken in the Agile progression, getting to the architectural level now, we can see that designing your organization is as important as designing your systems. So there's a lot of cultural aspects here as well. And then lastly, the future. You have to design the future. And what does that mean? Well, it means we just have to be prepared for the future. I think a lot of times we like to design systems, design software, treat it with such great care that we think it's going to last forever, right? And this is, maybe this is the 2001 monolith coming from through the ages, but microservice really is about it's disposable architecture. Right? It's about scoping things down well enough so that you're not going to feel emotionally scarred if somebody takes that service, throws it away because they need to put in another one. I think that's one of the tenets, but this whole concept of evolvability and constant motion of the systems really is underlined once you break things apart. So, who is the example of the ultimate microservices shop? Is anyone here from Hootsuite? I know Hootsuite's a sponsor here, and I know I spoke to some of them. One of the gentlemen who wanted to be here, but he's been quite sick the last week, so he's not infecting us. We'll be able to share quite a bit of wisdom. Hootsuite is a tremendous example of a microservice architecture shop. So we've got a whole blurb in our book on the Hootsuite setup. And they really got, if we look across that whole spectrum of design-based approach, they're all over it. So why did they move to microservice architecture? They had a PHP monolith. They weren't able to develop fast enough. They'd grown to a scale of about 100 plus developers, and they just felt like there was too much weighing them down. They wanted to have these independent teams able to develop software a lot faster. Also, they wanted to have a lot more operational flexibility. So they found with the monolith that if they wanted to scale certain parts of the monolith up or down, which might require that, they weren't able to. It was too coarse-grained. So that if they broke things down, then they could, add more service level availability and requirements to certain aspects that needed it, and then not have to overutilize in the areas that didn't. They are very focused on domain-driven design and very focused on establishing contracts for their services. This is fundamental because when you get into testing, right, you'll hear a lot of high-level talk about, well, microservices are great because it's easier to test now. But you drill into that and think, well, is that true? There's probably aspects of testing that could become a lot more complex when you're dealing with a highly distributed system. But it really comes back to the fundamentals of establishing and trusting contracts. So if you have those interfaces that are in front of your services, as long as you're disciplined about it and stick to those contracts and live by those contracts, then you can get testing gains. Otherwise, it can be a bit chaotic and even more complex. They've already evolved to the point where they recognize different types of services that they're going to have. So it's not just about a microservice is a microservice. They actually categorize it and say, some of our services are closer to the data model. So they're more like data-oriented services that are going to be used a little bit more across the organization. So rather than accessing a database directly, you can go through this microservice, and you can get better loose coupling that way. But also there's more functional microservices that have more business logic in them, which are going to be more composable and used across. And then they also have a facade service, or types of services, which are actually there exclusively to decouple the external consumers from the internal core business logic. They want to make sure that they still have the liberty to make changes internally without impacting their external customers. Foundationally, they've done some really good work around engineering a platform. They've got they're very heavy users of Consul, HashiCorp's kind of service discovery and resiliency open source model, which is we got some really interesting capability in it, and they're using Nginx gateways connecting to that, and they may use our technology too. I'm not here to talk about that, but then they use Mesosphere as well for managing the whole container infrastructure. So really good stuff. System-wise, I mentioned that they have service discovery in place. One thing that they've done that I think is definitely ahead of the curve. Right now, all the focus in the microservice world is runtime service discovery, at least in my experience. Everyone's saying, okay, now that we have all these services, and we have all these instances of services, and they're ephemeral type services, they're dynamic and everything's changing all the time, it's hard for us to keep track of everything. So we need to have something in place that if I want to find an instance of a particular service, I want to be able to find that instance right away and make sure it's reliable. That's good, that's needed. But nobody's really thinking about the design time side of that. So I'm a developer, I'm building a new application. Where do I find service? What services are available? What can I connect to? And this is a little bit more well-defined in the web API world and the RESTful API world. But a lot of communication between microservices are asynchronous using messaging platforms, in which case there's really no definition around how things go. So most of the industry is really, I don't want to say immature, okay, really behind, haven't yet hit that problem of the design time side of things, but I think they will soon. What Hootsuite's done is they've actually, rather than say, let's invent a whole new process for doing the runtime or do the design time side of service discovery, what if we could use what we already have in our runtime side and surface that so that we can use it in our design time? So they've actually created a way of getting into Consul, finding the service registry there, finding out what services are available, and then visualizing that, which I love. They generate these SVG graphics, which are then linkable so that you can see a service, it comes right out of the live registry so you can trust it, and then you can click on it and drill down, you can find the actual Git repo for that service, you can find the operational documentation. So they really are taking a look at how to manage this overall system, and not only thinking about it at runtime, but also thinking back to the overall, how it evolves and develops. Really good stuff. And their organization is really, it's something that they paid a lot of attention to. So they went into this with a very clear goal. And this, again, is driven by the goal. So they're like, we want to make sure we're liberating our developers, making things move quickly. So they've kept very small teams, 5 to 7 people. This is something that we've seen with a lot of the companies we've talked to. How big is a microservice? Well, small enough that it can be supported by a team of 5 to 7 people. That's one of the definitions that we've landed on. So they've got these small teams. They also have a cross-cutting platform team. And what that platform team does is they really work as an enabler. They're an empowering group. They're actually quite a senior group, so they are like the authority to go to for understanding the system. But their leadership style is not to be punitive and say, "Hey, you didn't follow the rules, go to jail." They're much more about, okay, how do we empower these teams? How do we, like gardeners, how do we make this thing grow? And they have guilds as well, which are like opt-in guilds. So you want to be on the Node guild, here's when they're meeting, and it's totally up to you whether you join or not. And they've seen some success there. This is my favorite quote from Bear at Hootsuite. We were trying to ask him about governance style. Like how are things governed? How do you actually make sure things are working well? And he says, well, We do have a set of guiding principles, and that's something we put a lot of thought into, so everyone understands what the guiding principles are, what we're trying to do, but we're not doing anything religious around that. What we're doing is we're observing, and then when we see we need to make changes to the principles, we'll do that. When we see that there might be some team behavior that's straying away from it, we'll address it collaboratively. And he likened their governance model to eventual consistency. So it's like governance by eventual consistency. Rather than trying to be strict up front, they're saying, okay, you know what, over time we'll make everything work and adjust, and it's working quite well. And then lastly, you know, they are seeing some of these system effects and putting it into addressing it as well. They've just formed a more formal, rather than guild type setup, they formed this technical architecture group that are looking at some of the bigger issues that are cutting across teams so they can be addressed. But again, they've got quite a bit of democratic representation from across the organization. So it's a great example. I think that you know, we're going to be working more with them on sharing the story. And as I said, there's more detail in the book as well. But I love it because it's a Vancouver company. This is a hometown team. Okay, so lastly, you know, some of the things to look out for, because again, you could have the goals, you could have the will, you could have the idea of how to approach it, but there's just some fundamental things that you probably want to have in place, as well as some things to look out for. This is a pretty typical, this is kind of adapted from the Fowler list of prerequisites. You know, having cloud infrastructure is really helpful because it just is more attuned to the type of nimble architecture that you're going to be using. Continuous delivery, again, it's not so much that you can't do microservices without continuous delivery. It's more a case of you're not going to get the benefits without having the ability to do frequent deployments because you're going to be choking on a bottleneck earlier in the cycle. Similarly with DevOps culture, I did work with one unnamed Canadian bank, not CIBC. I'm not going to throw them under the bus. This was a different one who had a new CIO come in and said, from now on, everything is going to be microservices. And if you've ever worked at a Canadian bank, you can laugh at that. But, you know, it's like everything's going to be written in Node.js, which that doesn't sound like polyglottism to me. But you know, everything's going to be Node-based. Everything's going to be microservices. And I was talking to them saying, wait, aren't you the guys who have like 3,000 developers in one organization that report up to somebody who reports to the, you know, to the CEO, and then 1,000 people in the operations organization, like, you know, and yep, that's us. So you know, they're not going to get very far. And again, you know, I don't want to be purist and say, you know, if you're not like fully DevOps, you're never going to get anywhere. But again, it's just something to look out for, that a lot of the benefits that get attributed to microservices are things that come out of these things that really begat microservices. And then the system control thing, I've probably beaten that to death. APIs. So containers, I put a question mark there because again, Netflix is an example of a company that certainly at least started out with microservices or the flagship and weren't using containers. But everybody's using APIs. So I think APIs, and I know I'm the API Academy guy, of course, but APIs are fundamental because they actually give you a way of expressing the service in both technological and business terms. So if I can understand the API for a service, I understand the service at the level I need to as somebody who's sitting outside of that service. Right? I don't need to know whether you've Dockerized that service. All I need to know is that there's an API available that I can use. And this is really important in the architectural aspects when you're looking at how all those pieces fit together in the domain. So some of the pitfalls you can get into, right, is just being over-rotating on the technology side of it. Yes, it's new technology and it's fun, but I've already probably illustrated cases where you could Dockerize your whole monolithic application and not only uplift the same problems that you had, but make them worse, right? And then similarly underemphasizing the system aspects of it. Unquestionably, I don't think I covered this, but this is probably not a surprise. The success stories that we've seen are very iterative, right? It's not a case of the case I just said where thou shalt all do microservice at the same time. It's more a case of looking at, you know, if you're looking at a model, what is the piece that's the main pain point right now, or what's got the biggest opportunity to peel that off into a service, plant a seed, and then start building the momentum momentum up for getting microservices. Don't go big bang. And I already mentioned as well, don't design for done. Never assume you've done anything. Nothing's ever done. You just want to get the right velocity up so that you can always try and keep pace and change over time. And then the blind spots here, I think, are some areas that I think aren't getting enough attention right now, which is not surprising. So system monitoring and management probably is getting a lot of attention in the microservice world, but it still needs lots and lots and lots of attention. Because as I said, maybe we're looking at things from an operational perspective, but when you pull it back and look at the earlier you can address these system aspects in the life cycle and in the progression of your microservice architecture, the more impact you're going to have. Service design and orchestration is another area where now people are saying, this is great, we've broken everything up. And then they say, oh wait, I've got a mobile app. I don't want to make 50 calls to get one customer profile built, right? So there's more, I think there's more evolution that's going to happen around what's available there. Security and policy enforcement. I haven't said security yet, have I? Maybe earlier on when I was talking about emerging things. And in fact, I was sad to see, security is so important. And then we had the lunchtime discussions and pre-lunchtime discussions, and we were standing over at the microservice table, a smaller group at the security table. I feel like this is like a tsunami that's kind of rolling through the ocean. It's going to hit the microservices world because it's just the more open you are, the potential for vulnerability is greater. And if you look at the school of thought around security for microservices today, it's very, very bare bones. It's like, you know what, API security probably will do the trick. So you just, use all. But that's both maybe not enough and too much at the same time, because the web technologies that we're looking at for securing APIs grew up in a place on the open web which is very different than where a lot of these microservices are residing within a single organization. There's a lot to come on that. And then the idea of the integrated testing, I think, as I mentioned before, really paying careful consideration around the test implications of what you're doing with microservices. Because if you're not strong on your contract, then you could open up another wound. Okay, so just in summary, right? Microservice architecture is agile software architecture. And if you disagree, you can hit me afterwards. But I feel pretty good about that one. Speed and safety at scale is a good mantra, and I think achieving the harmony between speed and safety as you go up the scale is really what's I think a new potential for what microservices can be. Design-based approach, very important. Like I said, as technologists, we love jumping into technology, but I think that really trying to keep yourself at a layer of abstraction and understand what's the overall system looks like and how you can influence it is important. And that holistic approach has been the essence of these early microservice adopters, making sure that you're not just looking at containers, making sure that you're looking at the organizational aspects, how your development teams are going, what processes they're following, achieving harmony between all those things is important. And finally, just look out for those things I just mentioned. Okay, well, thank you very much. I can take some questions if you have questions. How much time do I need? 10 minutes per question. Did I end? Yep.
Our discussion here. We have success stories of how microservices help you refactor problem analytic or faulty code.
I would say, so the question is there a success story that shows how you can refactor a monolithic application using microservice approach? I don't want to steal the thunder of the presentation that's coming up. So that's one case study. I would say probably, I think every single case study I've seen in microservice, every single company I talked to in some form or another, that was their starting point. They're not starting with a green field saying, you know what, we have a clean slate, we're going to just start and build a microservice architecture. There's a lot of debate on whether or not that's a good idea. But all the case studies are coming from the perspective of we have this big ball of mud and we need to break it down into microservices. But I mean, in terms of the detail, I think that's the perfect session this afternoon. Yeah?
Yeah, so if you're designing a single application with a bunch of microservices, is there a lot of concern about how those services might be together? Because once you start having, say, another application that have the same services, then you sometimes find those individual services are no longer good for those applications. Okay? Whereas one service ended one another again.
Yeah, so the question is around, what about dependencies ultimately between services, right?
Yeah, I mean, if there's only a single application, it's sort of make your service whatever you want. Once you suddenly have a second application using the same API, you can find that API doesn't work in two applications.
Yeah, and this is where the architecture comes in. So the question is around if you just have a single application, what benefit are you going to get from trying to make that into microservices because you're going to have these dependencies form. And one thing you'll find is as you survey the different case studies around microservices, the size of a microservice completely, if you just look at it from business function and scope, varies widely between companies. Like some will say, hey, like Amazon, hey, we're doing microservices, but their microservices are big applications that just happen to be architected in a way that they can talk to each other through APIs. So if you optimize between the dependencies that you're going to build and then actually the benefit that you're going to get out of that, I think that will help. So the other thing is that in the microservice world, and this is something that's very different than SOA. SOA was all about build it once, reuse it across everywhere. That has declaratively been said, no, that's not necessarily the way you want to go with microservice. It's probably better if it's slowing you down to reuse, just build your own service that does the same thing. And we've seen a lot of those instances. Now there's a better happy medium between those, but philosophically, the speed overrides the efficiency of the reuse and the experience of the reuse. But I think in the example you cite, if the application you're talking about is the type of application that could be supported by a single team, and I wouldn't worry about thinking of that as a monolith. You could just call it a microservice or a mesoservice or something like that, just slightly bigger. But unless there's a real need, a real business driver to push you towards the microservice architecture, then it's not. Why would you do it, right? And I think that. And this also brings up another principle we were talking about at the table, which is I think it's probably better to be too big on the scope of the service than too small. Because if you break things down too far, you guys were saying this, right? It's hard to merge. So anyway, there's a lot of practical thinking that goes into that. We should never just do the architecture for the architecture's sake. Yeah.
You mentioned ideal kind of team 5-7 people to manage the business of Scrum. So is it like universal? Do you see extremes like one person managing or team?
Yeah, we've seen. So the question is your team size, and this is actually. So I'm not the team size expert in the 4-person team that wrote the book, but one of my colleague Mike, he's done a lot of research in this area, and he was going into Conway, and then he came across this anthropologist named Robin Dunbar, who did Dunbar number studying of different sizes of your family, your close friends, your extended friends, and so on. And this Dunbar number kept coming up, and we talked to companies, always 5 to 7 people, 5 to 7 people. So that was pretty consistent. And to the point where we're, thinking that it may be better to adjust what's in your service and change your service boundaries to fit the team size than it may be to, just focus on an explicit bigger business domain. So there's different factors that are going to go into how you draw your service boundaries, but we just found this strong affinity between that size of a team and the success of a microservice architecture. Certainly we've seen some organizations where maybe they have a 20-person team, but it's really like 3 sub-teams working on different things. But we definitely didn't find any success stories where it was like a massively split organization where functions were horizontally spread across a large organization. Definitely this vibe of you build it, you run it.
Talk about Conway's law and how team structure has an impact on the architecture. Do you have any insight on how to have an influence at that level in the organization?
So the question is, Conway's Law, which I mentioned earlier, it's important. But how do you do what's being called the reverse Conway maneuver? I think that was, I forget who used that
Right,
term.
you're coming from
That might have been James
technical
Lewis.
side, where typically that's more like a management people activity.
Yeah, well, I think that's something that it's a tough one, because I would suspect that in the organizations where the technologists can have an influence on the organizational structure are probably that's the type of culture that's going to be a good fit for microservices. The type of culture where you would feel embarrassed to go and talk to the technology executive who's in charge of the structure. Probably the culture's all wrong anyway. But the argument I'm making, I'm publicly trying to make this argument, is that somebody, either the architect needs to have input on the organizational structure, or they have to work harmoniously with whoever does have input on the organizational structure. I would say this, I mean, if you've worked, those companies which have kind of the anti-culture of what I'm talking about, like that I happen to work in a few of them, they love doing reorgs. Like there's nothing if you're a high-level executive in a large technology organization, it's the only card you can play, right? You're removed from the technology, you don't know who's coding, it's like all you can do is reorganize. So get their ear, if that's the case, and see if you can redraw the boundaries. But I think the important thing is to understand how everything is fitting together, and understand if you got a really bad mismatch, because it could be pretty deep. Okay, probably had one more question, and then we all drink coffee. Okay, thank you very much.